So, good evening, dear visitors. It is an honor for me to share the next 90 minutes together with Father Philipom-Nerim. After his one lecture and one discussion, I don't think we need to introduce him for the third time in an extensive way. But perhaps as a way of short introduction, Father Philipom-Nerim is a current professor of philosophy at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas in Rome, also known as the Angelicum. He completed his studies at the Catholic University of America and his doctorate at the University of Notre Dame. And he is also a very charismatic person, a very funny person, but also a very logically precise person, and it's a delight to listen to him. So this format, perhaps, we will try to go beyond his lectures and try to see a little bit of his life story, and we can ask him perhaps more personal questions. So, Father Philip, first question would be, to kick it off, if you could paint us a picture of you growing up in the United States. You come from Annapolis, as I correctly... Annapolis. What does it look like there, and how was it like growing up?
Yeah, so actually, I was just telling someone yesterday that Annapolis is, in some ways, a U.S. parallel to Bratislava. It is, for the United States, Annapolis is a very old city. It goes all the way back to the original colonial settlers. It's a very charming, beautiful, kind of quaint, cozy city. The streets are very frequently cobblestone, so the similar kinds of stone that you see here in Bratislava, and it's a city that is in proximity to much larger and sort of more big name cities, right? You've got Vienna nearby, you've got Budapest nearby. Annapolis has Washington, D.C. very close to it in one direction, a city called Baltimore that's a very big city in the States in the other direction. And yet, like Bratislava, there are many ways in which Annapolis is better than all those cities, right? And precisely because it's smaller, it's more intimate. There's just a more comfortable feel to the city than the kind of frenetic energy that you might see in other places. So actually, I feel very at home here.
Do you have UFO breach too, like strange UFO breach?
This is news to me.
You haven't seen it? It's very close. Okay, we have to show you tomorrow.
Okay.
So, how does someone from Annapolis become a professor of philosophy? Tell us a little about milestones on your journey. Sure.
So I was raised a Catholic, but when I was growing up, it was just my mother who was a Catholic. So my father, as I was growing up, was an Episcopalian, which is sort of like the U.S. version of the Church of England, or an Anglican. He did eventually convert to Catholicism, but I was old enough to remember when that happened as sort of an event within our family. So I have two younger sisters, and the three of us were raised Catholic, but never went to Catholic school. So we went to private secular schools for our elementary or grade school education, for our high school or gymnasium. Is that what you? And then for me, when I went to college, I also went to a secular liberal arts college in the U.S. So I often joke that I didn't go to Catholic school until I became a Dominican. But so growing up for me, the faith was always something that was a minority position that needed to be defended, needed to be articulated, but was not something that was a pervasive, formative element in my life.
Would you say it was more habitual or cultural?
So I would actually say that for myself growing up, it was more intellectual, right? So the faith for me growing up was a matter of, do I know the answers to certain questions that I ought to give as a Catholic? And can I say something moderately intelligent to diffuse any criticisms? Mm-hmm. But then that was the end of it, for me growing up, right? And so it really wasn't until I left and went away to college that I really began to think through whether and how the faith was going to be a deep element of my life, of my very identity. And so when I was in college, two things happened that providentially occurred at the same time. So the first was I made friends with a number of very impressive, very bold and confident and fervent young Catholics at my college, which, there were not very many Catholics at all at the college that I went to. Mm-hmm. And precisely because the faith was always under fire, was always a marginalized thing, these young fellow Catholics that I met in college were a great inspiration for me. They gave me an example that I had never really seen before of someone who really, really believed and really tried to live out their faith in a way that was countercultural, mm-hmm. right? On a secular American university campus, even just being a Christian in a kind of minimal way was already countercultural. But so to me, they looked like aliens. So I guess I have had UFO experiences. So but they were attractive aliens. They were impressive aliens. They were inspiring aliens. And they were also, they were critical aliens, right? So, this was one of the first times that I had friends who called me out when I wasn't living in accordance with the faith, who, just said, like, if you actually believe, you need to change the way that you're living. So that was the first element. The second element is it was at the university where I encountered philosophy for the first time and fell in love with philosophy. And even though it was a secular university, a secular college, it was a liberal arts college. So the center and the soul of the approach to education was a classically liberal education. So not, at that point, there were plenty of progressivist kinds of elements, but the approach to education there and then was not an aggressively progressive, ideologically charged kind of left. It was a more classically liberal sort of leftism. And so they wanted us to read broadly. They wanted us to engage with opinions that were diametrically opposed to the opinions of the professors. And so for me, I fell in love with philosophy when I started reading things like St. Anselm of Canterbury's argument for the existence of God, right? And it was the first time that I had ever encountered a purely intellectual argument where I thought, I don't know if this is right or wrong, but if this is right, then God exists, and he's basically what the Catholic Church says he is, and I would need to change my life. And that was a powerful, transformative experience for me, because it meant that philosophy mattered. Theology mattered, right? The life of the mind, the intellectual life mattered. And if it was lived well, if we were authentically pursuing the truth, then that truth would need to trickle down from the mind to the heart, from the realm of the speculative to the way that practically I was going to live. And so in God's providence, I kind of, in American English we say he hit me with a 1-2 punch, right? So on the one side I was getting hit by these really good, really fervent, really wonderful examples of convinced Catholics, and on the other hand I was getting hit with a new appreciation for the importance of the life of the mind, the importance of the intellectual life, and so as I began to read more about the faith that I was being challenged to live more, what I discovered was that these two things, the heart and the mind, were not opposed in the Catholic tradition, right? The very thing that I was experiencing as a call to a kind of unified living, right? A kind of integral, holistic, complete way of life was exactly what I was finding in the more I read about Catholicism, the more I read about the faith, that up until that point had in my life never really penetrated beyond the head.
So Professor George in the previous Plato's Cave mentioned that he read Plato's Gorgias, and it was a transformative experience for him. Mm-hmm. For you, it was Saint Anselm.
For me, it was Saint Anselm. Yeah, it was. So the two texts that I read, sort of hand in hand, were in philosophy, Saint Anselm, and in theology, Saint Athanasius. You know, one of the really great fathers of the church, and so they were in very different ways. Both of them were examples for me of men who thought that the faith mattered in a radical way, right? And so, like I said before, up until that point, the faith had all, I had never lived in a way where the faith was the main central controlling aspect of my life, right? It was always there. I never fell away from the practice of the faith, right? But it was always marginal. It was always a minority position, right? But here I am reading, Saint Athanasius, who at the very, in the very earliest days of the church was willing to lay everything on the line for the truth that Jesus Christ is truly God and truly man, right? Anselm, right, is, he's this monk, living in this medieval monastery, and yet he's totally convinced that if we dedicate our reason to the pursuit of truth, what we will find is the triune God, is the God of our Christian faith. And for me, that was similarly transformative to the way that Professor George was talking about his experience of reading the Gorgias and that call to truth, right?
Was it also scary? Professor George mentioned that once he read Gorgias, that he was feeling a little bit of fear of what it would actually mean to search for truth authentically. His life his opinions would have to be radically changed. Was it perhaps the similar experience? What would it mean to live out the faith authentically with what I intellectually believe to be true?
So for me, it was not scary. I think part of that is that I've in a great many respects, I have an undeserved degree of confidence, right? So for me, it was just a matter of, do I think this is true? And if I think this is true, then I'm going to go for it, right? I'm going to be all in. I'm going to commit myself completely to it. So for me, actually, the moment of sort of fear or horror or terror or whatever you want to call it, came from a different source. It was because, like I said earlier, for me, there has just never in my life been an opposition or an antagonism between philosophy, theology, spirituality, piety, right? Like, for me, the spiritual dimension of my life, the pious dimension of my life, it came alive precisely when my love for philosophy came alive, and so those always came together, philosophy and faith. But so for me, actually, the moment of fear came when I was diving into the philosophy side, precisely because when you do philosophy, one of the things that you're called to do in order to seek the truth well, right, is to take alternative arguments seriously. And so it was when I was reading. So there's an early modern philosopher named Baruch Spinoza, and Spinoza had been a great student of Judaism, and then was exiled from his synagogue and became one of the great sort of opponents of dogmatic religion in the early modern period. And so when I started to read Spinoza, I encountered a system of thought for the first time that was vehemently opposed to Catholicism, vehemently opposed to Judaism, vehemently opposed to the authentic revelation of God, and yet, for me as a young university student, at first glance, it looks completely rigorous. He begins his book. It's called The Ethics, but it's about a lot more than ethics. But he begins it with things that look like clear definitions, and things that look like obviously true statements. And then from clear definitions and obviously true statements, he starts to demonstrate conclusions, and it's like reading Euclid's Elements, right? The foundational text in geometry, right? And so for me, that was the moment of fear. Was the first intellectual experience of, well, wait a minute, I've got this over here that I'm convinced is true, right? Both from the faith and from my use of reason, right? I'm walking through the arguments of Anselm and Thomas Aquinas and all of these incredible Christian Catholic thinkers. But then over here, I'm now being exposed to secular philosophy, and just with reason, at least initially, that also looks compelling. So for me, the moment of fear was this sort of oh no moment of, well, wait a minute, what if this is true? Because these aren't compatible, right? And so for me, that was the moment of, if you're authentically and rigorously seeking the truth, right? Trying to use your God-given gift of reason, inevitably, right? Professor George has repeatedly talked over the last few days about how, we are frail, fragile, fallible creatures. And that means that when we use our reason, we often make mistakes. And so for me, that, you know, I mentioned I'm extremely self-confident. So for me, a moment of sort of this intellectual moment where I was not confident on my own as to which of these arguments was the right argument, which of these philosophies was the right philosophy, that for me was the moment of, uh-oh, right? But you know, the part of the saving grace for me was always that the faith never went away. So there's a French Catholic philosopher who was very prominent in the early years of the 20th century named Jacques Maritain. And Maritain has an image that I find very beautiful and very helpful for the role of faith in living our intellectual lives. So he asks us to imagine a lighthouse on, you know, so this tower that right on the coast that has that shines a light on the darkness of the waters. And the lighthouse is always firmly set on solid rock. It's never going anywhere. It's not in danger of sinking. It's not in danger of collapsing. It's just always there, and it's always shining a light on the darkness of the waters. The ship that's at sea is shown by the lighthouse what parts of the sea it shouldn't sail into, what parts of the waters are dangerous waters where it will run aground and sink. And so the ship can avoid that section of the water that the light from the lighthouse illuminates. The lighthouse is faith, and the ship is our reason. You know, our reason is fallible. Our reason is weak, and no matter how smart we are, our reason is always in danger of running aground, running into the shallow waters and sinking. And so the faith can reveal to us where the mistakes are. So for me, that was an extremely liberating experience, right? I encountered secular philosophy for the first time, was terrified that it might be true, right? And if I'm being a good philosopher, if I'm being a good reasoner, if I'm being an honest thinker, then I have to seriously consider that might be the case. And so it was that experience of the salvific effect of the faith that was absolutely transformative for me. So I was able to say, okay, in humility, I don't know what Spinoza got wrong, but I know that he got something wrong. So I need to think a little bit harder about this. I need to take my time and sit with this and talk with people who are smarter than me about this and see if I can discover where the error is, even if right now I can't see it clearly. And that has been, for me, a way of living the intellectual life that I think that's authentically Catholic, right? That's a vision of the intellectual life where we can be simultaneously humble and hopeful, right? That I don't need to have all of the answers at every moment in order for me to be confident that there are answers, right? And so I think in many respects, the Catholic thinkers, Catholic intellectuals are the freest of all intellectuals. Because though at that moment, way back when I was an undergraduate, I did have a crisis of confidence, right? I did have this kind of existential crisis. What I've learned since then is that you don't need to have an existential crisis when you run into an argument that that is opposed to your beliefs, right? Whereas if I didn't have the faith, then every time I ran into an argument that was opposed to my beliefs, that would have to shake me to the core. Otherwise, I'd be reasoning in bad faith.
I would like to come back to this topic, but perhaps in the discussion later on. But let's move on. Can you tell us a little bit about your vocation? How did that happen? How did you join Dominicans?
Sure. So when I was in college, my third year in college was the year that Pope Benedict had his first World Youth Day. It was in Cologne, Germany. And at that point, 3 years into college, I had really taken ownership of my Catholic faith. I was diving into both, the living out of my faith in the liturgy, in private prayer, in Catholic community with this really, really wonderful group of friends in college, and I was diving into the intellectual side, right? I was reading Catholic writers, I was looking at Catholic philosophy and theology, and so I was pretty deep in, and providentially, I got a phone call from a priest that I had known while I was growing up at home, who was leading a group of high school and younger boys to Cologne for World Youth Day in Germany. And he needed help chaperoning that he needed more eyes, right, to keep track of all of these younger boys, and so he called on a number of guys that he had known when we were younger, who were now in college, right, and he thought, well, college guys are probably going to be interested in a summer trip to Germany, and we were, so we all joined him, and I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity to be at a World Youth Day, and quite frankly, I don't know what the more recent ones are like, but this one in Germany was a sort of glorified and graced chaos, right? There was this huge, gigantic field, and a big stage where everything was happening, but a lot of the time things would be happening in, so Americans are not like Slovakians in this respect. We don't know other languages. We barely know that there are other languages, right? So at this point, I only know English, right? Which means only very occasionally could I understand anything that was being said. But more importantly, there were so many people on the field that you're pretty far away from the stage, so you really can't hear anything except they had these headsets, right, that would sort of be passed around through the crowd, and each headset would be translated into a different language, and so I just, in God's wonderful, beautiful, divine providence, I was handed a headset that was translating into English. I think it was like the third day or fourth day. And so I put it on, and I have no idea what the Holy Father was actually talking about at that point. Because when I put the headset on, he sort of stopped the main point that he had been making, and he said, as a sort of side comment, he said, if there are any young men out there on the field today who have never even once prayed about the possibility of a priestly vocation, I want to ask you as a personal favor to me to pray about it just once. And if there are any young women out there on the field today who have never even once prayed about the possibility of a religious vocation, as a personal favor to me, I want you to pray about it just once. And so I thought, well, can't say no to the Pope. So
Binds intellect.
Yeah, exactly, right? So so I was like, well, all right, fine, I'll do it once. So I did it, and then the thought wouldn't go away. So I'm like, uh-oh. And so by the end of, we were there for, I think, 2.5 weeks, and my group. So by the end of the 2.5 weeks, with this kind of haunting me the entire time, I had a conversation with the priest who had sort of coordinated the whole trip, and I said, listen, this won't go away, so I think I might have a vocation, but I'm not excited about that, and I don't think I can see myself, I was 2 weeks into praying about a vocation, so of course I know everything about discernment. So I said, but I don't think I can see myself being, just a diocesan priest, a parish priest. And because remember, I grew up in secular America, right? So what I told him, and this is, I think I'm quoting myself word for word. I said, so I don't think I want to, be a parish priest, and monks are weird. So is there anything else, right? And, so he's, so he said, well, I think there are more mature ways of going about discerning, but to answer your question, yes, there's something else. There are mendicant friars, right? So there are religious orders that are not monastic, and they're things like the Franciscans, the Dominicans, the Jesuits, and again, I had been discerning for 2 weeks, so I knew everything at this point. And so I said, "Aren't the Jesuits bad?" And he said, "Well, look, there's nuance there. There's lots of religious orders are going through lots of things right now, but maybe for you, you should look at look more at the Dominicans. I think would be a good fit." So I get back to the States, and I look up the Dominicans online. I pull up the website, and I see this, and I go, "He lied to me. Those are monks," right? So for me, I needed to learn about religious life in the church. I needed to learn what is the difference between a friar and a monk. What are these different religious orders all about? And so the more I read about the friars, the more I thought that would be a good fit. And I had no idea that Thomas Aquinas was. I wasn't even particularly attracted to Aquinas at that point in my life. But I didn't know that Aquinas was a Dominican. But I was learning about the Dominican approach to the deep unity between our life of faith and our life of reason, the deep unity between piety and doctrine, right? And all of that was attractive. As you can probably tell, I love to talk. So the idea of being part of the order of preachers was very attractive to me. But when I finally went to go visit the friars and actually met the Dominicans for the first time, it was something that one of the student brothers said at the time made a really deep impact on me, which was, he said, he said that when he first started to discern, he went to the Dominicans because he thought that it fit him. But that the longer he lived the Dominican life, the more he realized that he wasn't called to the Dominicans because it fit him. He was being called to the Dominicans because he needed to be transformed to fit it, the Dominican life, right? And that for me has been very, very true. That the process of vocational discernment, the process of finding where the Lord is calling us to be, who the Lord is calling us to be, is a process of conversion and change and transformation, right? That I need the order far more than the order needs me, right? Yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay. Just perhaps a clarification. You went on to join the Providence of the
Province, the Dominicans,
Providence of St. Joseph, yeah, the famous one from the Aquinas 101 videos. Okay. So you mustered up the courage to join the Dominicans. Talk us through the journey of your studies up to your position in Rome now. Sure.
So I am, maybe before we get to the studies, I should say this with regard to my path into the order. So I'm part of a very elite group of Dominican friars who are affectionately, we're called retreads, which means, so what it means is this, is we entered the order, left the order, re-entered the order. Perhaps this is not news to anyone here, but the process of religious formation begins with a year that's called the novitiate year, so where you are a novice, and that's a whole year before you have made any vows, right? So the two key vows that are made are what are called simple vows. So that's poverty, chastity, and obedience for a set period of time. And then there's solemn vows, which is poverty, chastity, and obedience, usque ad mortem, right? Even unto death. So the novitiate is a time for learning how to live the Dominican life, learning what the religious life is, but before any vows have been made, right? And so the idea is that if the novitiate is working well, then people who don't think that they're called to religious life will leave during the novitiate. Mm-hmm. So the first time that I entered the Dominican order was immediately after I graduated college. So I went
after bachelor's? Or?
After my bachelor's, yeah. So I went directly from my undergraduate into the order, and so I was in the novitiate for about 7 months, and then thought, nah, I was very attracted to the idea of being, getting married, big Catholic family, being a philosophy professor at a Catholic college, right? And, living out my Catholic faith in that sort of a setting. And I just thought, I should, this is something that is really attractive to me. And if this is really attractive to me, then I should go explore it. So I left the novitiate and went went back home to Annapolis and started working in Washington, D.C. And basically what happened is, as soon as I left, there was no bolt of lightning that struck me for making the wrong decision. There was no whale that ate me for making the wrong decision. Actually, what happened was the Lord just blessed me over and over and over again. And so he made it extremely clear that everything that I wanted, everything that I was attracted to, everything that I was asking for when I left the novitiate, he either gave it to me straight away, or he made it obvious that this door is open. And so I had an experience of kind of radical freedom, and quite frankly, also radical happiness. Right, so my time after leaving the novitiate was a time of complete, perfect, natural happiness. I got the girl. I got a really high-paying job. I was able to take graduate classes at the Catholic University of America in philosophy in the evenings after I finished work. I had an extremely wonderful group of very faithful Catholic young professionals, graduate students who were an amazing group of friends. Just everything lined up. And I was 100% happy on the natural level. And I was still constantly thinking about the order. I was still constantly thinking about the life of the Dominican friar, the call and the charism of preaching the gospel for the salvation of souls. And it just got to a point where I realized, if I have everything that I could ask for on a natural level, and I want more, then either I'm crazy or I have a supernatural vocation, a supernatural desire in my heart. And guess what? We don't give ourselves supernatural desires. God gives us supernatural desires. So in American English, we have this funny phrase, I ate humble pie, right? I realized, okay, I have to reach out again and go through the whole process of applying again. You have to go through psychological evaluations for a second time now. But I was reaccepted.
So you were not crazy by the test.
So not crazy, but called. Yeah. So I went. I returned to the novitiate. There was a lot of intervening time, but I went back to the novitiate, finished it this time. So made my simple vows in 2010. Then went to Washington, D.C., which is where our studium, our house of studies is. I made my solemn vows in 2013. I was ordained to the priesthood in 2015, and I have never looked back. I am totally confident that despite all of my faults, all of my failures, all of my weaknesses, this is where the Lord wants me to be. This is who the Lord wants me to be, and so I've been extremely blessed in my life in the order. So my first assignment after I was ordained a priest in 2015 was an awesome first assignment. So my province, so the Dominican order worldwide is split up geographically into different provinces. So here, there's a province of Slovakia here. I encourage you, all of the Slovak friars that I've met, and a few of whom I now live with in Rome, they're wonderful, good friars, good men. But so my province on the east coast of the U.S., we run an undergraduate college, a university. And so my first priestly assignment in 2015 was to teach philosophy there and also to serve as the assistant chaplain for the school. So I did both campus ministry and classroom teaching. And our community of friars there, it's a big community, and it's in American religious life, that community is extremely rare because there are friars of every age. So there were guys. When I was there, there was one friar who was in his 90s. He was 92, but friars in their 80s, 70s, 60s, 50s, right? 40s and 30s, and in America, that's very rare. There's a generation of priests and religious that's basically missing. Who they had been functioning as priests, and then the bad years of the 70s and the 80s happened, and they left, and so it's usually a gap. But that community there's no missing generation. And so it was a beautiful experience of fraternity within the order. So my first 2 years as a priest there were really, really wonderful. The ministry working with college students was fantastic. The community was really fraternal and warm and supportive. And then when I was sent on to do my doctoral studies in philosophy, I went to the University of Notre Dame, and while there's no official Dominican community there is, while I was there were about 5 or 6 of us in any given year from all of the American provinces who were studying in various fields, and so we had a kind of we lived together. We lived the Dominican life together, even though we didn't have an officially established community. And I had a wonderful, wonderful experience there, and certainly learned a lot of philosophy. At that point, I was firmly a Thomist, right? Very extremely well formed in Aquinas's philosophy and theology, and so that time at Notre Dame was a real opportunity for me to begin something that I continue to do now, which is dialogue across traditions. So if Thomism is true, and it's true, then we shouldn't be afraid to talk with anyone who is seeking the truth, right? And so contemporary analytic philosophers, there are lots of legitimate criticisms of that as a style of philosophy. It has certain excesses, but they're genuinely seeking the truth. And so so I had a really good experience of encountering them, learning to dialogue with them. And it broadened my own philosophical horizons. And then as soon as I got the PhD, I was sent to Rome, which now I've been in Rome for 2 years. I have the privilege and the opportunity to work with the Angelicum Thomistic Institute, which is not the same as the Washington, D.C. Thomistic Institute that does the Aquinas 101 things. It's extremely confusing because many of the friars who are associated with the Angelicum Thomistic Institute, like me, the Father Thomas Davenport, have also done work for the Washington Thomistic Institute. So, we show up in some of those Aquinas 101 videos. But the two, the Washington TI and the Angelicum TI, we have very similar visions and of sort of Thomistic world conquest, right? So we're taking over the world, and roughly the way it works is the Washington TI is sort of taking over the place where all of the places in the world where English is the first language, and then the Angelicum Thomistic Institute gets the rest of the world. So we've been founding chapters all throughout Europe. Our newest chapter is a chapter at the University of Bucharest in Romania. And so through that, I've had the opportunity to do a lot of travel, to give talks all throughout Europe. We're expanding also into Asia, into China.
Slovakia, I heard too.
Yeah, so Slovakia has the friars here in Slovakia have founded a Thomistic institute that we're collaborating with. It's Thomism is flourishing in the world, and it's just been a great grace and a great privilege for me now to be in Rome, to be at the Angelicum, to teach students from all over the world, and through the Angelicum Thomistic Institute to travel, to be able to have the opportunity to come here, to be with you, and to preach the truth who is Jesus Christ. And that's my vocation. And so I am very, very grateful to the Lord for giving it to me.
With that very, very good introduction into your life story, we can perhaps move on to the musical performance, and then we can discuss it with the audience too.
Great.
Hi, my name is Maria. Yesterday you mentioned that you could give arguments why AI cannot be truly rational. So could you tell us more?
Sure. So I'll give you, so I'll give you an argument that is probably the most recent argument that is currently being discussed among philosophers. So it's a version of something. So the argument, analytic philosophers, so philosophers in the Anglophone world, they love to give names to things and abbreviate whenever possible. So this is called KRA. So it stands for the Kripke-Ross argument. But actually, the best version of it is given by a young philosopher named Antonio Ramas Diaz. And so the way that Antonio puts the argument is, it goes like this. There are some operations of thought or activities of thought that are what he calls formally determinate in character. But no material thing or configuration of material things can be formally determinate in that way. Therefore, there are certain operations of thought that are not material. In other words, there really is something like immaterial intellectual thought. Now, that's a very abstract argument. Here, let me illustrate it for you. So the kind of formally determinate activity that he has in mind is something like, so here's a mathematical operation that all of us can do. We can all add, right? So we can all do addition. And we all know what it is to do addition. And it doesn't matter how big the numbers are, how small the numbers are, we know how to add them, right? Good. Now, so you can think of addition as a sort of function where you give it kind of inputs and then you get outputs. So if I give the addition function the input 2 and 2, then the output is 4. Yeah, exactly. So we can all add. Great.
Proven.
Proven, right. Now, suppose we can define, in mathematics, you can define a function however you want. So suppose I define a different function. It's not addition. We're going to call it quaddition. And addition and quaddition are almost exactly the same. Give them both 2 and 2, they'll both give you 4. Give them both 2 and 3, they'll both give you 5. Give them both 2 and 4, they'll both give you 6. But eventually, when the numbers get almost unimaginably high, addition and quaddition split. So suppose that number, whatever it is, right? So you just, for quaddition, whenever the inputs would give you an output that's bigger than a certain number, it just gives you 0. Right? So at a certain point, addition and quaddition split. We can define that function. That's not mathematically hard to do, right? You just stipulate it. Why am I bringing this up? Because we know roughly how big the material universe is. And we know roughly how much matter there is in the material universe. Which means we know roughly how many possible configurations of the material universe there are. Now, how big is that number? Really big, right? The possible number of material configurations of the universe is enormous. right? Almost unimaginably, almost unthinkably big. But we do basically know what it is. Which means, if the number at which addition and quaddition split is higher than the number of possible configurations of the universe, of matter, then in principle, matter and the material configuration of the universe is undetermined with respect to addition and quaddition, right? If you're a materialist, if you're someone who denies that the intellect exists as an immaterial principle, then what you have to say as a materialist is that any activity that we do is nothing other than a configuration of matter. But guess what? The configuration of the material universe cannot tell us whether it would be adding or quadding, right? You can think of it like this. You know, you have an abacus, where you kind of push the beads, right? If you're doing addition on an abacus, are you also doing quaddition on an abacus? Well, from a material standpoint, there's no difference, right? You know, when you move one bead over there and move another bead over there and move another bead over there, right? Addition and quaddition are going to give you exactly the same things. But we all know what we're doing. We're all adding, not quadding, right? So there's in principle no way that matter or material configurations could tell you which one of those things you're doing. But there's no question about which one of those things we're doing. We all know which one we're doing. We're all adding. So what that means is that that's what Antonio means when he says the formal determination, so the operation is formally determinate, but matter is never formally determinate in that way. You know, a material configuration, right? One setup of the abacus could be a way to set up and sort of like express adding, but it also could be a way to set up and express quadding. So just the physical thing, the abacus, can't tell you which one of those two things it's doing. But the entire material universe, if you think of it as a gigantic abacus, still can't tell you which one it's doing, adding or quadding. So the argument is kind of simple, right? It's just, look, these sorts of operations are formally determinate. We know what adding is and we know what quadding is. But matter, even in the biggest possible configuration of matter, never has that kind of formal determination. Which means that operation of thought, of intellect, can't be the same thing as matter. And so right now, you know, contemporary materialist philosophers of mind are kind of freaking out about that argument. Because there are similar arguments that have been given in the past that they've found ways to object to, but this particular version of the argument avoids all of those objections. So, yeah, so there you go.
I was freaking out too because last year I read this argument over the summer because I was assigned an essay on the immateriality of the intellect. And I was going through all these proofs, Aquinas' proof, Krikeros proofs. And I couldn't tell at the end, so I burned out, heavily spent the whole summer reading the arguments. I was like, I quit the school. So now I'm on the gap year on the way back to philosophy somehow. Perhaps, do we have another question in the audience?
Yes.
Yes.
We do here.
Great.
You mentioned that Thomism or Dominicans for that matter, are flourishing. And you also mentioned that the word bad Jesuits, which I already heard at the World Youth Day. And I am a big fan of Jesuits, and I like Jesuits and also Ignatian spirituality. But it is true that their situation, especially in the United States, troubles me. How do you see this issue? Is there any, will it resolve in the foreseeable future? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. And so I should say, and this is connected with my point about just how the Lord has blessed me so much. So when I was at the University of Notre Dame, I had the blessing and the privilege to really get to know well a fantastic community of Jesuits there. In South Bend is the name of the city where the university is. So actually, I do want to say, my personal experience of the Society of Jesus is without qualification good, right? The Jesuits that I've known, both the young Jesuit scholastics and the older Jesuit fathers, have been wonderful, faithful, intelligent, prayerful men. And so I hear the same sorts of things that you all hear about the state of the society, and I'm sure that we need to take what we hear with a grain of salt. But I can at least say that from my personal experience, the young Jesuits that I have had the pleasure to meet and to befriend and to really share life with give me a ton of hope for the future of the society. The Jesuit, among all the different Catholic religious orders, the Jesuit order is one of, especially for male religious, is one of the biggest, right? And so the bigger an order is, the bigger an institution is, the harder it is to make really significant sweeping changes, right? So I have no idea about a timetable, right, for when when things will change, how things will change in the Society of Jesus. I'm not a Jesuit, but I know from the young Jesuits that I've met that there are there's good reason to hope for them. On the Dominican side, it absolutely is true. There are provinces that are getting more vocations. There are provinces that are getting fewer vocations. And there are lots of people who say lots of things about why and what the difference is. Especially in America, you will hear people talk about, you'll hear people say things like the religious orders and the provinces that wear the religious habit get more vocations, and the ones that don't. The religious orders and the provinces that are more orthodox in their theology get more vocations, the others don't. Things like that. Sociologically, right, just as a demographic observation, I think that's true, but I think that's an unhelpful way to think about it and to approach the issue. Because suppose the opposite were true. Suppose it was just a fact that that heterodox orders, orders where the teachings of the church were not being upheld, were the ones that were getting vocations. And religious orders that didn't wear the that just presented themselves as if they were lay people, right? Suppose those were the orders that were getting vocations. Does that mean we should all just shift gears and become heterodox? No, of course not, right? We are called, this is a saying from Mother Teresa that I love, God calls us to be faithful, not successful. And so our goal as religious should not be to get vocations. Our goal as religious should be to be faithful religious. Our goal is to conform ourselves to Christ, and in my case, as a Dominican, by following St. Dominic and living well the Dominican constitutions, right? Our forma vitae is what we call it, the form of life of the friars. And if God wants to use my living out of my Dominican vocation well to bear an enormous amount of fruit, great, he can do that. If God wants to use my living well of my Dominican vocation to bear a tiny little bit of fruit and nothing else, he can do that. I'm not the one who needs to worry about the results, right? What I need to worry about is living well my religious life. And that's true not just for the friars preachers, but it's true for every religious, right? So our task is just to be good religious. And God will give the growth where he sees fit in his holy providence.
Can I perhaps follow up on that? Part of your religious life is dialoguing with the world. I mean, you are called to be preachers, you go to universities, even to secular ones. And this will tie up nicely with your lecture on secularism. How do you see yourself, or how do you approach the dialogue with the secular world? We have seen Robbie George talking about comprehensive worldviews, so perhaps a little challenge, let's try it, would be you have mentioned that there is an LGBT ideology, but does that count as a comprehensive worldview worth engaging with? How would you lead a dialogue in that setting? Let's say with let's take a more concrete example: Judith Butler and transgenderism. Let's talk about that.
Okay, so there are a lot of things there in the question. So first, is the LGBTQ agenda a comprehensive worldview? I think probably no. I think it might be an element in what someone like Professor George would call a comprehensive worldview, right? So perhaps like radical progressivism might be a comprehensive worldview, and then the LGBTQ agenda would be part of one element in that comprehensive worldview. Is it worth dialoguing with? So yes, I belong to the Order of Preachers, so our charism is to preach for the salvation of souls, right? And so as long as there really are souls that have adopted this as an element of their comprehensive worldview, right? That, look, all souls need saving, right? We are called to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ to the entire world, right? And so if I were to look at someone and say to myself something like this person's worldview is so radically different, so radically opposed to mine, that there's just no hope for me to speak to that person, right? I'm failing as a Dominican friar, and I'm failing as a Catholic, because there is no one who is beyond redemption. There is no one whose way of life, way of thought, right, comprehensive worldview is so radically distant from the gospel that they genuinely can't hear it. And I think, especially in this respect, right, as Catholics, and when we're talking about the preaching of the gospel, we have even more reason to hope and be confident than if, what we're talking about is like Thomistic philosophy, right? I think Thomistic philosophy is true, right? It gives us like the right fundamental principles, it's rigorous, et cetera, but there's no guarantee. God does not guarantee that, that he is going to give grace to someone to be convinced by Thomistic philosophy. But God guarantees that he is going to give the grace that we need to hear the gospel, right? So yeah, absolutely. So the how do we do it, right? How do we dialogue with people whose identity is really, really deeply tied up with things like the LGBTQ agenda, things like transgenderism, right? All of that. Just, honestly, by having the courage to speak the truth and by making it unambiguous that we love that person. And quite frankly, the arguments that we give, so it is important to give arguments. And I honestly, I think I cannot stress this enough. And this isn't just like a Dominican intellectual, right? Being a Dominican intellectual, right? Like this is true for every single Catholic, right? If you are unwilling to give, as the scriptures say, a reason for your hope to someone, if you are unwilling to actually give an argument for why the truth is the truth and a lie is a lie, right? If you're unwilling to give that argument, you cannot love the person that you're talking to. So to love someone is, at least in part, to reason with them, right? To work for their understanding of the truth. However, people will receive the arguments that we give with a much more generous spirit if they're not in doubt about whether we love them. So the first step is to love unambiguously, right? To befriend them, right? To look them in the eyes, right? To not be, afraid of who they are, what they represent, right? If it's very easy for people to tell whether you think they're a friend or a foe. And if people can tell that you're approaching them as if they were an enemy, then it is reasonable and natural for them to put their defenses up. And the higher their walls are, the more significant their defenses are, the less likely they are to hear the preaching of the gospel and to hear the good, valid arguments that we give.
The reason I'm asking is because in Slovakia, we are in a state of big polarization of the society. The walls are pretty high. What would be your suggestion to us? How can we bring those walls down? And also how to spread the gospel in a way there is a debate. If we are talking to the other person, how not to deny Christ in the first place, but yet the other person, if you begin to talk about God and he does not even believe that there is something like an objective truth that we can know by reason, then it doesn't ring or it doesn't resonate with him. So what would be a prudent way how to approach that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think, so there are people, both, radical progressivists and also Catholics, right? There are people on both sides who are simply unwilling to meet each other, right? Who are unwilling to get to know one another, unwilling to even attempt to have a reasonable discussion. Those shouldn't be the people that you target initially, right? Those shouldn't be the people that you approach initially. But I also think that on both sides, those are actually the minority, right? Most people can and will have a reasonable discussion. And not just in big important matters of evangelization, right? But just as a general rule, whenever we're having a discussion with someone, we should start just by asking this question. Hey, what do we agree on and what do we disagree on? Right? And you listen to what they think about various things, you find common ground, and then you ask, okay, what can we do from the common ground, right? St. Thomas Aquinas has a very reasonable passage in the text, so not his most famous Summa Theologiae, but in his Summa Contra Gentiles, he has a passage where he just very simply observes. He says, look, sometimes we're talking with other Catholics. And in that case, we share as common ground reason, Old Testament, New Testament, church councils, church magisterial teachings, right? The tradition, all of it. And so we can reason on the basis of all of it. Sometimes we're talking with Christian heretics. And then, we have reason, Old Testament, New Testament, but they're not going, if we start appealing to the authority of the church, they're not going to be on board. Sometimes we're talking with Jews. And then what we have to work with as common ground is reason and the Old Testament. But if we start invoking the authority of the New Testament, that's not going to work, right? And sometimes we're talking with people who don't even accept the authority of the Old Testament. And in that case, all we've got is reason, right? And I think therefore, how do you have that discussion? You mentioned Professor George earlier today talking about how transformative his experience was reading Plato. I think Plato is an excellent exemplar for how to do this, because the very form in which he writes is a dialogue form. And how do those dialogues go, right? The participants in the dialogue work to find what are the things that they agree on and what follows from that, right? And in my experience, if you're willing to listen to what somebody else's views are, and in a non-aggressive, non-combative way, but nevertheless a confident and coherent way, you say, okay, interesting. I'm not with you on this, and this, but I think we agree on this, and this. Then they'll see that you're taking them seriously, you're thinking about their views reflectively, and usually other people will reciprocate. They'll do the same thing with respect to us, and then you have a basis for dialogue. And so as long as the dialogue is proceeding in love, I think there's and goodwill and good faith in this sense, right? That no one is being coy, no one's hiding what they believe, right? Or pretending to think something other than what they do. Dialogue is possible. No matter how distant the person may be from the faith.
Do we have another question from the audience, perhaps? 3 questions.
Yes. This is Tom Gray. I spent 2 years in Annapolis going to college. Maybe you can guess I was a midshipman for the U.S. Naval Academy that you didn't mention.
My dad and all 3 of his brothers graduated from the academy.
Yes.
My dad went Marine Corps as his MOS.
Yes. I wanted to ask about abundance and gratitude. And a couple of nights ago, or previously, you mentioned that the biggest problem is sin, which I can't disagree with. Sure. And yet I have the feeling that there's a malaise because of excess abundance and an ingratitude at the process, which I call Christian capitalism, which has created this material abundance, but has resulted in too much pressure and status on money grubbing. And I've enjoyed monetary success, comfortable, but not huge amount. And I think that the ingratitude is very easy for 2-year-olds and also 22-year-olds. And so I was wondering if you could comment on the gratitude issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question. So I have one of my Dominican brothers is a Dominican from the province of Nigeria, and this was something that he said to me many years ago, but it has really stuck with me. He said that he always prays that the people to whom he ministers, at that point he was working in a parish in Nigeria. He prays that all of the people to whom he ministers might be neither destitutely poor nor abundantly rich. And the reason why he prays for that is because in his experience, those in destitute poverty are very seriously in danger of despairing and thinking that God doesn't love them, isn't there for them, maybe even doesn't exist. And those who are overflowing in abundance are in extreme danger of thinking that they don't need God. And so his experience had been that those whose sort of material condition is most conducive to the faith is those who appreciate the fact that they are in need, but also don't despair that their needs will be met. And I think there's something really, really deep and really true about that. That, as Catholics, we live the theological virtues, right? To live the Catholic life is to live a life of faith, hope, and love. And the more secure we think we are in ourselves, the harder it is to live that middle and forgotten theological virtue, the virtue of hope. If we think that we have everything we need, and we think that we've achieved all of that on our own, then it's very hard to understand what you're supposed to be hoping for, because you've made it. You've got it all, right? And so I absolutely agree with you that a sort of worldview, a sort of attitude of living our lives that is focused on the acquisition of wealth, of property, right, of possessions, is something that very seriously endangers our living out of the Christian life, precisely for the reason that you identified, right? If you think that you've supplied yourself with all of your needs, then you have no reason to be grateful to God, and you have no reason to hope in God. And so I think those two things are very closely tied together. Hope and gratitude, right? Because what they have in common is a shared appreciation of the way that we depend on the Lord for everything. So yeah, I hope that addresses the question.
Unfortunately, we have run out of the time, but there's plenty of topics that we can cover, perhaps even after we finish.
Well, thank you all. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. But thank you very much, Father, for coming, for having spent time with us, with being honest about your life story. It has been a genuine pleasure having the opportunity to learn from you, and hopefully this is not the last time that we meet. Yeah. The Thomistic project in Slovakia, perhaps, maybe another occasion to meet. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Ja na záver chcem ešte veľmi pekne poďakovať ešte raz našim hosťom a takisto aj nášmu moderátorovi, takže ešte jeden potlesk pre nášho moderátora. A ďakujem aj našim partnerom a podporovateľom a zároveň by som vás chcela ešte povzbudiť k jednej veci. Aj tento rok sa na dofinancovanie celého tohto krásneho festivalu robí zbierka v hodnote 12 000 eur, takže by som vás chcela poprosiť, že ak sa vám páči tento festival a ak vidíte zmysel v tom, čo prináša ľuďom a v tom, čo robí, tak nás môžete podporiť darom 5, 10 alebo 30 eurami. Môžete tak urobiť prostredníctvom portálu Donácia.sk. A QR-ko tu nie je, ale určite si to tam môžete vyhľadať. No a teda vás ešte v rámci festivalu pozývam aj na umeleckú výstavu mladého slovenského umelca Samuela Riníka s názvom Boj o cnosť. A pozrieť si ju môžete v galérii Statua túto cestou von, alebo teda opačne. A ešte by som vás chcela pozvať, aj v rámci Hanusových dní sa bude budúcu sobotu a nedeľu premiérovať jedna autorská inscenácia o Svetom Františkovi. Budem v nej inscenovať aj ja, takže ak by ste sa chceli prísť pozrieť, budeme veľmi radi, ak prídete. A viac informácií a listky nájdete na hanusovedni.sk, ale máte to aj v rámci festivalovej permanentky. No a teraz už vás tradične pozývam na našu Hanusovú terasu, kde okrem občerstvenia, kávy nájdete aj rôzne krásne knihy, ktoré vám určite toho veľa dajú. V prvom rade úplne novú knihu Scotta Hanna Katolíci vo vyhnanstve o biblickej múdrosti na cestu domov do nebeskej vlasti a tiež nové číslo časopisu pre kresťanskú kultúru Verbum, venované novej kresťanskej generácii a mnoho iného. A taktiež stále prebieha súťaž liberálna versus konzervatívna káva. Ak ste o nej ešte nepočuli, môžete sa zapojiť kúpou kávy. Nielenže vyjadrite svoj názor, ale taktiež aj podporíte tento festival. Momentálne som sa bola pýtať, je to 10:06 pre konzervatívnu kávu, takže ak by ste to chceli zmeniť alebo sa zapojiť, tak nech sa páči. No a keďže je dnes deň otcov, tak všetkým otcom prajem všetko najlepšie, aby mali krásny deň a vám všetkým ešte pekný večer. Takže ďakujeme.